I'm Régine Debatty. I'm the moderator for this panel session. And the session is going to be dedicated to inventing the future, I think, with Liam's pretty spectacularly interesting talk. We have kind of an idea of what it means to critically and creatively look and engage with the future. But in case you just jumped in and arrived, I prepared 30-second introduction just to frame the conversation we're going to have. So I think that inventing the future is not just about projecting ourselves into the future using hypothetical scenarios and objects. Inventing the future is also about echoing current unease and responding to emerging cultural shifts. The architects, artists, designers, and thinkers who speculate around the future provide us with counter-narratives that dispel the myth of technology. And by doing so, they fulfill several important roles. The first one is that they help us envision, in all their complexities, the cultural, ethical, social, and political dimensions of the so-called disruptive technologies. I say so-called because disruptive is such a fashionable word these days. Another role they play is that they question dominant notions of progress. They challenge our fetishism for innovation and our anthropocentric mindset, reminding us in the process that the future doesn't have to be orchestrated, dominated, and invented solely by the gurus and the investors of the Silicon Valley. So joining this panel, there's going to be Baines and Chiedza Pasipanodya, and I'm really sorry if I pronounce wrongly your name, who together co-curating Hacking Black Futures, an exhibition of speculative design that took place in Toronto in a cultural space called BAND, which stands for Black Artists Network Dialogue. Chiedza is a curator, she's an artist and a writer, and André is an artist and designer. Also joining us is going to be Erandy Vergara. She's a curator, a writer of contemporary and media art. And she's also the artistic director of Eastern Bloc, which I'm sure you all know. It's an artist-run center dedicated to digital art. So each of them is going to speak for something like 15 minutes, and then we will convene and have a discussion together and with you. So should we start with André and Chiedza? First Erandy, sorry.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to MUTEK, the amazing team, to invite me to speak today. So I'm gonna wear two hats today as an independent curator and also as artistic director of Eastern Bloc. I'm very happy to be here, and to be honest, when I saw the title of the panel, I was very interested. I don't know what happened with the second part of the title, because originally it was entitled Inventing the Future, someone between the probable and the possible. And I really like this idea of thinking how we envision the future, think about possibilities and probabilities beyond utopian or dystopian positions. And so I'm also interested in the theme of the future as an art historian and thinker. My PhD dissertation was on interactive installations focusing on movement, and I explore how movement reproduces this idea of modernity and progressiveness. And so the future, it's at the core of my research. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about some projects at the Eastern Bloc and how we're imagining the future. How is it that an artist-run center focusing on emerging artists wants to start this dialogue with the new generations that are not necessarily looking for artist-run centers? And so I'm thinking also about the relevance of artist-run centers today in Montreal and in Canada in general, and also about a project I created on VR and other projects I'm working on VR and artificial intelligence, and how in the way we conceive exhibitions, in the way we engage with artistic practices dealing with technologies such as VR or artificial intelligence, we can shape that idea of the future in ways that go beyond the idea of blue skies, good-looking people, high definition, beautiful spaces. And so those are basically the points I'll discuss today. And so Eastern Bloc is a young organization. It's only 10 years old. This year we started 10th anniversary. I just started working there about 5 months ago, so I cannot talk a lot about the past of Eastern Bloc, but I'm going to mention some of the key projects and then move forward to explain how we're going to, how the artistic vision has shaped with my arrival and the idea of engaging with the emerging artists. So what I like about Eastern Bloc is its capacity to take risk and support innovative practices in Montreal. Unlike many other art centers that are older, the privilege of being an emerging institution is that you can bet in artists that nobody knows. You can be more experimental, you can improvise, you don't need to book exhibitions 2 years in advance. You can respond to last-minute questions and requests for collaborations, like I have an event in the next month, can you host it for an evening? I just need your space for 3 hours. And so this kind of flexibility, this kind of newness of the space allows certain opening of voices, but also of projects that might not be welcome in other organizations just because of the logistics, also because of economic reasons. So what happens sometimes is that Eastern Bloc has host projects and work in a collaborative basis where artists offer or propose projects, and there is a clear understanding that this is just like experimentation. And so that's something that I admire and really like about Eastern Bloc, is how it has supported initiatives of by emerging artists that other more established artists from Center cannot present because of their novelty and state of emergency. And I think about emergency in these two senses, about emerging, but also in terms of like just not being maybe mature and ready, but yet there are ideas that are pushing forward how we think about art and technology. So this capacity to adapt to changes in art making and the strong desire to support emerging artists within the margins of Montreal media art scene is Eastern Bloc's strength. So this is just a general idea of what Eastern Bloc has done in the past 10 years. So 10 years, more than 10,000 emerging artists have been supported, 60 members, 5 employees, 10 to 15 bénévoles per year, workshops, exhibitions, data salons, 9 editions of the Sight and Sound festivals, and many other statistics about the visitors to the website and all of the social media communities. And so, as you know, Sight and Sound is Eastern Bloc biggest project. This year we stopped it because of the transition, but this festival has been inviting local and international artists to come together and engage into different exhibitions, performance, and also panels and discussions. And the last edition, starting in September, from September to October, was non-compliant futures. So this idea of questioning the idea of progressiveness and futures was at the core of the last edition of the festival. So around 50 local and international artists participated either in the panels, exhibition, or performances. We also have a program of artist residencies. And so we are joining forces with other organizations. This winter, we partner with Media McGill to support one artist in residency for 4 weeks. Claude Perriot, she was developing this piece entitled Holy Numbers, where the information of the stock market was translated into different sounds that interact with living fish in a tank. And here are some images of the past editions of Sight and Sound. Another big project of Eastern Bloc is the Data Salon, and I want to mention this format because it's something that has function to allow emerging artists to show work in progress. The idea is that for one day, artists present the work. They have a professional photographer who takes pictures and documents the work in the gallery of Eastern Bloc, and also there is a space for artists to present the work and get feedback from the audience. So through this very ordinary model of presenting work, many artists such as Adam Basanta have a space to move from, I don't know, like traditional musicians to media artists and have this space where they can test and present work in progress without the burden or without more pressure of like performing in front of an audience. This is always a friendly environment and people can just present work. And so this format also allows for a certain flexibility and for emerging artists just to have a space to show the work. Also the documentation of the work is super important because then they have something that they can show professional pictures of their work. So, you know, in a very subtle way, this format functions and helps emerging artists to kind of get their feet on the field of media art. And so I also want to talk about the lab of Eastern Bloc. I don't know if many of you know it or not have been there, but actually I like to mention that the lab was created by 5 members who were ready to enlarge the space that the lab was using, and they just come up with, they built it themselves, and they created a system where people could pay in advance for having a personal desk, and with that money they built the lab. So even thinking about ways in which projects can be sustainable and self-sustainable was at the core of how Eastern Bloc imagined its lab. Now there is around 60 members in general, but there is about 15 lab members who use the space. Also, it's very important to mention that Eastern Bloc's lab, that many of the tools that we have are actually the tools of these lab members. So the idea of collaboration and working together and working with others are at the core of how the lab functions. So yeah, that's about the lab. Then there's Pirate Bloc Radio, our monthly radio program, CQUT, and some images of our Pirate Bloc Radio interventions in the public space, which is like another branch of Eastern Bloc. And so I want to mention how, or the future orientations of Eastern Bloc. And as I mentioned, to me it was central to think what is the relevance of artisan centers in Montreal and in Canada right now. When I was hired, like, you know, I'm part of the older generation that went trapped between the digital and analog generation. And for us, it was central to think, how can we continue to be relevant? We see that many young artists, I'm talking about like the artists doing, studying undergrad programs in art, are not probably coming to our events. And Eastern Bloc is a very young organization, but events of other artisan centers. And so how can we reach out to those generations that no longer need us because they have Instagram and they are creating all these kind of pop-up events and projects? And how can we respond to them? How can we adapt? And so there's many ways. One way is to integrate them into the programming committee, having them being creating some shows, having them collaborate with how we imagine the next editions of the Sight and Sound Festival. There's also a call for projects that we are going to, that we released last month, and the deadline is April 30. And the idea is to support, innovative and experimental uses of technology, critical perspective on technology and platforms, and technologies and platforms, engagement with socio-political issues and environmental issues, conceptual and aesthetic explorations of media art, post-colonial feminist and queer perspective, and so DIY strategies and the use of hardware and software and recycling materials. So those are kind of the driving forces of Eastern Bloc. This is the new, not so new, but this is the direction we're going to take. And so that's basically where we are going, and we want to continue. The focus this year, in the next year, will be on local artists. Eastern Bloc has been famous for inviting a lot of international artists, but we want to take some time to look at the art scene in Montreal, to support artists living here, and try to understand how we can be the force that propels these artists, this community, to the international scene. And so we want to be part of that dialogue, but now we want to support more local artists. And this is also why we want to collaborate with other universities and other centers. And finally, I'm going to talk about a project about VR. I'm co-curating with Tina Slalander. She is a curator from Berlin, and it's relevant in the sense that it is about thinking ways in which we can engage with VR, and we can do research about VR, but in ways that transcend this dominant narrative of immersive spaces that are highly embellished and realistic. And so the three main premises is always the body. So this idea of how can we learn from the early VR theories and art projects that question this idea of disembodiment. Also the politics of place, territory, and location in VR. So what are the spaces we are depicting? How are the bodies interacting in these spaces, positioned in terms of politics and in terms of aesthetics? So trying to transcend this idea of the neutral space of VR, and trying to understand how there is politics of place and how we interact and engage and shape space, just as space shape us, but what are the kind of spaces we're shaping with VR projects? And lastly, VR by whom and for whom. And this is about subjectivity. This is about who are creating VR pieces, who are the artists or big companies that are producing VR, and what are kind of, because of their position in the actual world, what are the kind of spaces they are proposing? What are the kind of spaces where they want us to be immersed, and how can we reshape or shake these spaces where non-white or Aboriginal artists have no space. And so we're very interested in female artists and queer artists, Aboriginal artists who try to tackle these questions and try to move forward, try to transcend this idea of figurative VR spaces. So that's basically some of the projects we're working on. Thank you.
Hi there. How are you guys doing? Good. Okay. So I'm Chiedza Pasipanodya. I'm an artist, curator, and a writer.
And I'm Baynes. I'm an artist, speculative designer, and curator.
And we're here to talk about a show that we did in Toronto called Hacking Black Futures. So Hacking Black Futures was part of the Toronto Offsite Design Festival from January 15th to the 21st. And it considered power through the critical inquiry of the future through art and design.
So the exhibition explored ideas pulled from a speculative Black-centric society in the future. The exhibition housed installations, illustrations, photographs, and offered an opportunity for viewers to explore each artist's vision for the future. This collective vision was a future that is dynamic, safer, and more whole.
So in partnership with OCAD University, where we both are, this show was exploring design speculation. It was also exploring an immersive multi-level installation that sought to transform the band 19 house and gallery into a cohesive future home existing into a Black-centered society that is devoid of notions of lack, which manifests as oppression, discrimination, and systemic racism. The band gallery was a perfect venue for us and perfectly aligned, as it's dedicated to supporting and showcasing the artistic practices and the cultural contributions of Black artists and cultural workers in Canada and internationally. So it was through this collaboration with intergenerational group of artists. There were about 16 artists, photographers, designers, makers, that this exhibition both investigated and envisioned ideas about a future that's quite unlike the inevitable one that's presented to us right now.
So how did we do this? We created a curatorial premise that was rooted in 4 themes and historical contexts. We asked these artists and designers to create work that responded to 4 questions around social economy and cultural capital, the maker revolution, sustainable systems, and food sovereignty. Today we'll be talking about some highlights from each theme. Starting off, social economy and cultural capital. So here the artists explored how capitalism is directly implicated in the past and contemporary enslavement of Black people. It was important for us to be critical about the ways in which capitalism impacts our own practice in art and design, and ask the question, what comes after capitalism? How can we create equitable economic ecosystems?
So within this consideration of social economy and cultural capital, we had work by Ade Nurse. And so in his images, he imagines a future with 3 individuals who have been able to achieve a higher socioeconomic status, gain cultural capital, and it's represented in everything from the clothes that they wear to the environments that they're set in. These images were about 6 feet by 4 feet, giving viewers the opportunity to sort of step into the images. And they explored the shifts of power for these individuals as they moved from objects to subjects who hold their own spaces. The single female model was the nucleus of the image and held the most power in these dynamics. And in the future, he envisioned a place where women were seen as equals and no longer any lesser, so removing the idea of patriarchies. Similarly, with Maisha's work in an Untitled series, she also uses photography to envision a future by recreating the past. And so she created some studio portraits that explore Ethiopian style and fashion, and it was an ode to her home in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Again, recreating the past to go back and to explore, and by going back, being able to create a future. Here we have Illumination, using a globalization to drive our community forward by Peter Scott. So Peter created a Black speculated futures card game that uses design thinking and foresight methods to frame the past, present the future, to frame the past, the present, and future conversations. So this game allows players to appreciate the contributions of Black leaders, opportunities, signals, trends, and to participate in speculating Black futures in the year of 2050, so in the further horizons.
The Maker Revolution. This theme looked at the proliferation of the increasing access to digital and traditional fabrication tools, things like 3D printing, laser cutting, and open source electronics, as well as makerspaces and tool libraries. And we looked at how these platforms have enabled smaller groups of people to create things that weren't possible just a few years ago. But also in the ways in which Black communities lack access to these resources. This theme was a reaction to mass production. It explored the distribution of power in production, and so that many more of us can have access or the opportunity to decide how we will physically build the future. The question we asked with this theme was, how might we improve access to such tools and ensure that they have a positive impact on Black societies?
So here we have Loud Micro Studio Kiosk created by Kimani Peter. So in Loud, he envisioned a future of record labels. In this record label, it's Black owned and it's collectively operated. This box was about 6 feet by 3 feet, and it was a compact studio built for everyday use. Here, he acknowledges that Black communities have rich musical traditions that have formed and informed the foundations of almost all popular music and culture. He envisions a way in which artists can use the compact studio to record from anywhere. Wireless technology would then send the recordings to an offsite studio for later mixing. Here we have work by, just a little spinny, okay. Here we have these flat bowls that were hand-turned by Dejawan Hamilton. So for Dejawan, she's considering the considerations to sustainable living that are rooted in the materials as well as the finishings. They reflect a sort of timeless aesthetic that exemplify form and function, but she's also considering the ways in which they can be placed in any home at any time. The bowls, again, have been spontaneously hand-turned and then finished with coconut oil, and sort of alluding to this cultural significance of a material that is familiar for people from Caribbean-Canadian descent and African-Canadian descent.
Sustainable systems looked at continuing the conversation from the Maker Revolution. Here, artists challenged the notion of accountability in the direction of markets, how planned obsolescence, material extraction, and the perpetual waste is built into our product life cycles. Under this theme, we explored sustainable systems for living and making, asking how might these speculative Black societies be more conscious about the objects they make, buy, use, and throw away.
So this work is called Frameworks by Denzel Arthur and Thomas Graham. So using an artistic practice, this was an exploration of technology, taking tools originally designed for productivity and questioning their role in a speculative Black society. So here Denzel is using laptop screens and tablets that are deemed not usable, and is applying open source electronics to have them respond to people as they enter the space by lighting up. In this way, it brings a sense of responsibility. It brings in our responsibility as a society to make sure that our digital tools coexist with our ecosystems in order to create a healthy environment for all those who inhabit our planet, and also has us questioning what happens after we're done with our devices and our objects. These were denim wigs that were created by Renee Matthews. Made from old denim jeans and including wire for the sort of the ponytail there. She deconstructed these jeans she's had since she was a teenager and repurposed them by hand, taking over a month for each work. For her, she sees hair as an integral part of Black culture and identity, as it's the most tangible and accessible, but at the same time has been policed and shamed throughout history. In her ideal future, she sees opportunities for Black peoples to be free and safe to express themselves as individuals and move away from standardized Eurocentric beauty standards. So for her, these wigs propose an alternative as well to the current synthetic options, and considering our sustainability, these synthetic hair options produce mindless amounts of plastic waste. And this is another image of me wearing the wig. And so it shows the ways in which it can be worn by a number of different people.
And finally, food sovereignty. So having acknowledged our capacity to make choices and take action, the theme of food sovereignty was explored. With an understanding of the ways in which industrial food production inside and outside Canada exploits migrant workers and contributes to environmental degradation, we explored alternatives. This theme interrogated and offered a possibility for the ways in which Black societies might control our own food systems. So
here we have Tree Tank by Ashley Jane Lewis. With this piece, she was exploring a future of free people who were striving to circumvent the social and economical enslavement of all sectors by designing and fabricating solutions of their own needs. And it was connected to their ancestral roots through advanced knowledge of biocultures, botany, and plant cultivation. So she has foggers that regulate the humidity, light strips that adjust the light levels and a screen display that shows stats of the atmospheric conditions of the incubator and allows the user to upload setting adjustments should they wish to house a different foreign plant in their home. In this case, she has a Jamaican orange tree, and using accessible materials, she is emulating the natural climate within this tree tank.
So this piece was a collaborative work between me and Ashley, and it's titled Living Lab. It was a piece that represents a future in which nature is part of the home. It's a work table that gives the user a place to simulate a living ecosystem, a place for learning and observing the complex relationships between organisms. The table housed a small-scale model of a North American forest floor containing various species of moss found in the surrounding environment. It existed as a speculative tool for increased agency around our relationship with food systems and our environment. And the work was a direct reaction to the exploitative practices in Canadian agricultural migrant workers programs, and meant to shift the goal of agriculture from extraction to a symbiotic relationship. And I just want to talk about the kind of core idea behind this exhibition. It was curated using a speculative design perspective in which storytelling is used to explore ideas outside of physical constraints. And this type of exploratory design can be a powerful tool for exploring design solutions and reframing socioeconomic issues through narrative and story. So I compare speculative design with science fiction filmmaking, where this kind of exploratory approach to design around technology, culture, and society has historically driven how we frame the future and the role of technology in our lives. However, media and film has constrained our expectations of this future and who is valued there. So it was important for us to ensure that Black experiences are represented in the stories about the future and also in spaces where innovation around the future occurs. So with film and storytelling at the core of this process, prop making becomes critical artifact design, where story and critical research drives the creation of narrative-based artifacts. Rather than directly propose design solutions, the objects in this exhibition were tools for reframing complex problems. The viewers were then invited to touch and engage with the work, offering their own insight and stories, where set design is interpreted in the gallery space.
And so when we were in the gallery space, we really wanted to explore how we could shift this idea of the white walls, the white space, and by having the artists touch the work, engage the work, by having the visitors engage with the work, we wanted to sort of begin to break away the notions, again, these Eurocentric notions of engaging with artworks and making them intimate, personal, and utilitarian as well.
And then finally, the actors becoming participants. So the participants, or the people who came to the exhibition, they became involved in the way that the narrative was expressed. Each individual added their own experience to the larger collaborative story told in the space.
And so for us, we thought about daring to invent the future. In Hacking Black Futures, we wanted to directly address the erasure of Black people in speculative design, as well as represent the growing ownership of our own future initiatives and the practices of making. We were inspired by Thomas Sankara, the Burkinabe revolutionary, who both openly challenged French hegemony in West Africa, but also called for the scraping and taking away of Africa's debt to international banks and to their former colonial masters. And for us, we saw him as somebody who could see another way on the horizon. And he said, you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from nonconformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future, and that we must dare to invent the future. Thank you.
Is this working? This is the microphone is working? Okay. Great. So we have something like half an hour for discussion. I'm going to monopolize the discussion in the beginning. I have a few questions for each of the participants of the panel, and then I'll leave the space for your question. So I'd like to start with Andrea and Chiedza. I have a question for you. I have several questions for you actually, but I'll start with this one. What I found very striking in the example and the values and ideas you talked about is that they're very seducing and interesting for non-Black people as well. So is there something you think, I guess I have a double question, like, did you take something from the exhibition and the works that could provide a lessons for non-Black citizen, and also was there something really specific that you don't find in mainstream design or in ways to engage with the world?
I can speak to the first part of that. So I think the work was made, the work and the show was made to intentionally center Black people, but with the acknowledgement that it included everyone else as well. But I think we were working towards flipping the general narrative, which is that Black people, queer people are often on the margins of these conversations. And we just wanted to really work to bring them in the center and then everyone else on the outside. So I can speak to that piece.
Yeah, I think I think it was really about centering those experiences in the larger context of kind of the direction of the future. I think that every individual person can bring something to that question about where's the future going, and so for us it was just important to make sure that Black voices are heard in moving in that direction. So I think that there's a lot more work to be done in that area, and sort of like involving more people in a space like that to be able to, especially people who are not artists or designers. And that was kind of the idea around the sort of like actors becoming participants, in that like the people who came to see the work, we wanted them to also be engaged in that conversation about in these different themes and categories. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a curiosity. So do you find that you manage to engage all audiences? For example, did you notice that the visitors, they were predominantly Black, or, did you find you managed to generate interest among everybody in Toronto?
Yeah, I think we had a really great showing, and we had a lot of different kinds of people come into the space, educators, students. We had people as young as 2 in the space, and all the way up to their mid-70s, 80s. And I think what excited people about coming to the show was that it was something that it was accessible. So if you weren't in the design world, you could still grasp the concept of like food sovereignty. And if you weren't, an artist, a visual artist, or if you weren't a designer, you could still enjoy the furniture, the bowls. The living lab was a space to play around and explore. And I think it was an accessible space because it encouraged curiosity. It was really rooted in like the sort of inquiry-based learning. Almost all the work you could touch. And because it was also in a gallery that's like a house, it's set up like a house. Like immediately when you step into the space, there's a sense of familiarity, you know, and every room was sort of set up to mirror the themes. So you'd enter one space and it's this area of sort of exploring cultural capacity. You go upstairs into what might be a bedroom and it's exploring this idea of the maker revolution, right? So it works with those existing ideas that we have of like a nuclear family home. So I think it was accessible for everyone in that way.
Okay. And earlier on, André pronounced the magic word, which is science fiction. So I'm going to turn to Liam, because just before your talk, you told me that you're working also in Los Angeles and in the entertainment, and also cinema. And recently I was listening to a podcast, and was this French writer of science fiction, and he was discussing the fact that science fiction is really, really popular if you look at TV and cinema. And according to him, I don't know everywhere else, but at least in France, almost no one reads science fiction. And one of the explanations he had is that when you write a book about science fiction, you have more freedom and more space to be political and provocative and maybe a bit disturbing. So is it something you've noticed? Like, when you work with people in Los Angeles, do you censor yourself, or?
No, I guess my role there is to do the opposite, I suppose. Like, I don't think Hollywood science fiction films are decidedly apolitical because they want to be or for commercial reasons. They're just shit, and most of the people that work on them are idiots, is generally why that happens. So, I mean, my campaign is to try and seed, like Trojan horses in that entertainment industry, critical minds, people that come from design background, cultural thinkers, because I don't think Hollywood is resistant to ideas. They just don't know how to deal with them. There's not enough people in the industry that understand that you can tell a different type of story for different types of audiences, or that include different types of narratives about the future. It's why we just get recycled versions of 1980s cyberpunk over and over and over again without any of the political movement that genre evolved out of. So it's really about trying to infiltrate those territories and seed them with interesting ideas, because I think that's a really exciting space right now. So you don't need to kind of hide it in the pages of a book. You should put it on the screen, because it's the power of these mediums which is really exciting, because so many people watch this stuff. Film and fiction has this amazing capacity to connect with us. You know, we sit in a dark room and we cry and we laugh, and we should be doing those things based around really exciting provocations about what our future could be, not just the same old cliches and kind of white Western male stereotypes.
But you know, when watching your images, I found it very, very overwhelming. And you said something, you talked about an architecture so large that it has become invisible. So I was wondering, what remains to human agency? Because it's really overwhelming. You have the feeling nothing you can do. I mean, you can recycle your trash properly, but is it going to change a lot, or keep your phone a year longer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason why I think film and fiction is an interesting point to start in relationship to this is because the changes required to do something about this future, or this present really, that we're talking about, are cultural changes, right? Deep-seated cultural shifts, paradigm shifts are required in order to do this. And it's not about any singular project that can do this. It's about creating a culture around the production of preferable futures, or a culture around the production of alternative narratives. So really, I think it's not any singular move, although every little thing helps, but it's about trying to develop a way that as a culture we can talk about these types of complexities. You know, the dominant narratives around our technology is a solutionist one. You know, like here's a phone, new phone, here's a new feature. It's gonna give you a better orgasm. It's gonna make you smarter. It's gonna connect you to connect people better. But we should be finding ways to talk about these things that acknowledge some of the misuse or the other side of these futures, right? And we just don't have a language through which to talk about that. You know, like I don't think that, as I was talking about, that when Musk comes up on a stage and talks about this extraordinary, powerful vision of a future where everything's going to be run off solar cells, and his battery, which you can now buy for $720, he can also acknowledge the landscapes where these things are produced. And it shouldn't be seen as a compromise for that vision. You know, it's still a lot better than fossil fuels and oil-powered futures and fracking. But to deny that these things exist just perpetuates this model of a very singular vision of a future and a singular relationship to technology, and denies the potential misuse. So you end up with what happened yesterday and probably what's going on as we speak, and Zuckerberg standing in front of all these people trying to reverse engineer a platform that they made without any understanding of its potential for misuse. If we built that into it, that a conversation around it when it first evolved, we wouldn't have a fascist government that was elected last year, you know, or a couple of years ago, right? And I think that's the big campaign, and that's why the power of fiction can be really useful to create those new cultures and new ways of talking about different types of futures.
So, Erandy, I was wondering, what is in your opinion, what can the role of an art space be when it comes to shaping these new visions and inventing new narratives and new future?
I think the short answer is a space where the decision-making process involves the future, in terms of having younger artists. We can just, I just think there is a, the younger artists are coming with a strength and with tools and ways of thinking that older generations might not have. And I think we can...
Could you really give examples of that?
Yeah, like for example, like I'm thinking about artists using Instagram, for instance, and ways in which organizations use Instagram for communication purposes, but not with a clear understanding of the strategies that can be used artistically to subvert or just reflect about these technologies or issues around these technologies, such as sex, sharing, connection, disconnectivity between people. And I think one way in which you know, like I don't think about the idea of opening spaces for anyone. It's productive in the sense that when you think about opening spaces, it's because you're in a privileged space where you are the one opening the spaces. But when you allow others to sit at the table and engage in that discussion and engage in that conversation and decide what's going to be exhibited or presented in these or other spaces, then things change a little, because then there is a distribution of power and there's other voices involved in the decision, not only in like exhibiting. There's a difference between exhibiting and then having these voices being part of how we're shaping the discourses. So for me, that's central to how we imagine the future. And in those futures, if we want not only younger artists, but marginalized voices, non-white artists, Aboriginal artists to be part of, they need to sit at the table and make decisions.
How do you find them?
I think knocking at doors, like talking to people you know, talking to scholars or professors that might point you in the right direction, and even specifying in calls, for example, to say, not that you privilege, but you are welcome and you hope to get projects by these artists. Yeah.
Good. Let's see how much time I have to ask. Yeah, I have a question, I guess, for probably each of you, because when we talk about future and speculation, it means that, well, you have your ideas and your scenario, which are more or less powerful and that suggest things. But how much space do you leave as curators, creators, designers, artists? How much space do you leave to the public to fill in the blanks, to engage in the reflection and to think about the consequences of your work? Because I guess you don't make everything explicit. You leave some space for reflection.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when we make our films, I don't know. Films are a strange medium because you just kind of make this thing, and then you put it up on the screen or you put it online, and it has its own life. So the interpretations that exist around it are many and varied. I mean, never. I mean, when I talk about the work, I do things like what we saw this morning. I don't unpack it and say, you know, this is what I was thinking about when I made this. This is why I made it. I just tell a story because I'm not interested in demystifying that process, or I'm not interested in presenting my reading of it and why I wanted to make it. I'm just interested in putting it into the world and getting a reaction, which is a very strange thing in at least my discipline, architecture, you know, where we over-explain shit and we write books about it and we do PowerPoint presentations. I just, you know, like the luxury of being able to make a work like a film and just put it out into the world and let it be misinterpreted or let it be fucked up or let it be shared in the right in ways that are interesting, ways that are less interesting. That's the way that I try and think about it, and I try and make work that that at a surface level you can just appreciate as a story, but then if you scratch the surface, you realize that there's something else going on, and there's another message that contained in that fiction. The fiction acts as a vessel for a whole series of other ideas. So if you spend more time with it and you dig around online and kind of put your own version of that project together, you might find something else, but it still has to work at that very surface read. And that's hopefully what gives it traction outside of the discipline, and what generates a larger audience for it. So that's the way I kind of put it out there, I guess, yeah.
I guess you touched upon it a little bit during your presentation about this idea of being very explicit and also giving space for the audience to engage and to intervene. But did you want to add something?
First, I'll go.
Yeah, so my sort of like some of my training is in industrial design, and when I was in school for industrial design, similar to what you were saying, Liam, the sort of idea is that all these global problems, all these issues, there's a product or there's a technology that can solve this, and then sort of the way that those things come about is, you know, designers sit in a closed room and kind of, you know, do research, come up with ideas, and then kind of after that go out and kind of deliver this sort of solution. And so I'm trying to directly counter that, and I think it's really important for me to create spaces that do not project that sort of idea of here's the solution. So I try to leave a lot of space for that, and the ways I hope to do that are in creating very like immersive and interactive spaces where people can come in and do something and make an action or learn something that allows them to participate in the narrative. So present a story, but then leave a lot of space for the people coming in to put their own experiences and their own skills behind that.
Do you want to add something? I don't.
No, I think it's best to allow for questions.
But I think also, sorry.
I think for me as a curator, my work is always interested. I'm always interested in filling in the gaps and in producing shows and sharing with people things that are often left behind, that are often on the margins, that are often on the periphery. So the content may change, but the intention is generally always the same about this notion of like unearthing and bringing to the forefront. So I think for me, even with this show, a lot of the inspiration came from reading Octavia Butler and just like reading and reading and reading, and discovering these sort of dystopian futures that are, you know, actually coming true as we sit here, and then trying to figure out, how do we bring this to people without terrifying them? Like, how do we make people excited about technology that aren't often surrounded by technology? Because it seems like for people that aren't in this world, they use it, but they don't think critically about it. So it was the sort of in-between thing of like exactly what you said, like having this beautiful space with great work, but then also having a lot of writing about the work or a lot of conversations about the work, so that people who want to know more can learn more about what's really happening in the background and why it's necessary now, right? And so a lot of the work as a curator goes into the inputs, goes into, you know, those little things like the work is aligned, the lines are straight, the labels are up, they're clear. All those little inputs allow for a space when viewers come in that is equal. So the input is equal to the output. And then there's this sort of in-between space again where, you know, the magic happens, I would say. Some people call it like source, the creator, that sort of thing. But something happens where people get it. Like it's the space where, you know, you set the table and then people come and then the food is good somehow. But you have to do the work of like making the food, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to think, it just made me think of coming back to inventing the future and the starting point of science fiction, that the space for audience is what happens when you think of science fiction or futuring as not an act of prediction, right? That says you put into the world one particular model, and you hope, you know, that you got it right? And the successor judgment of that is whether or not it does come true. But when William Gibson talks about his writings, he says that it's just been a coincidence that certain things that appeared in Neuromancer, virtual space and networked realities came true. He's much more interested in people reading the book and enacting something in the moment, right? When someone reads that vision of a future, and it's about eliciting action, and they make choices. And I think that's what's exciting about some of these kind of stories that you guys are talking about, you know, that it isn't about presenting future without an S, right? But it's about presenting possible futures that aren't trying to get it right, but are just trying to initiate action. And that's where they become much more active, and that's how you can involve an audience, I suppose, is thinking about futures in those terms.
Do you have questions? Oh, do you have questions or comments?
There was kind of some shade thrown on Silicon Valley, which is always deserved. And one of the things I've been thinking about lately is the weird polarity between the two prevailing visions of the future we have, which is like the sixth great extinction and neoliberal men with large rockets colonizing Mars. So given the fact that whether it's like tech empowered or tech fueled visions of the future, or Hollywood. Most people are never going to go to galleries. What places constructively, where are the sites for the construction of alternative narratives of the future? And I mean, this is more of a speculative question. I don't know if anybody has an answer, and maybe there isn't one, but I'm just wondering if there is. Because like the Mars thing in particular really has me depressed lately, because I feel like it occupies so much of the kind of bandwidth of where we do think about a possible future, and I find it so cripplingly lacking in imagination.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I really, my big project right now is to try and figure out tactics for intervening in these mediums of popular culture. Because just to reiterate, they don't need to be terrible. They don't need to be singular. Stories about these other kinds of futures are just as interesting, just as entertaining, have just as much shit blowing up as all the others. yeah, you're right. If we constantly just sort of continue to scream into the vacuum of, you know, exhibitions, artist-run spaces, rooms like this one, it's not really going to get us anywhere. And I'm interested in you know, the medium of the tech conference keynote and how you can play with that and talk about alternative narratives within that format. I'm interested in the medium of you talked about artists kind of occupying social media networks. You know, how you can actually disseminate these alternative visions through that as a platform, through VR, through immersive media. But you know, I moved to LA explicitly to try and like parasitically operate within the Hollywood entertainment industry, because I do think there's real power in that space, and we just don't, we piss it away to try and fill rooms and get bums on seats. So I think it's just as interesting to make The Martian as it is to then make the next film, which isn't about evacuating the Earth, but about directly engaging with mass extinction. I'm sure there's a Matt Damon narrative in that too. You know, it just needs better writers. Most people in Hollywood are, you know, concerned with the car they're going to buy, who they're going to date, how much money they're going to make on the next thing. So we just need to like put better stories out into the world and convince people that they work. And I think part of that is acknowledging the mechanisms through which these forms of popular media actually work, and that they still need to be great stories. They still need to have all the stuff that we buy popcorn to watch, but they don't need to end there, which is what most of them do. And I think, you know, we all should be a part of that. We all should be voting with our feet and going to see intelligent things, watching intelligent stuff, streaming cool shit, and avoiding the stuff that isn't as smart as the rest.
That's actually a good. I'm going to jump in because, as you know, I work mostly with socially engaged art, and that's the question. Oh, sorry, that's the question we've never solved. So, probably doing the work of an infiltrator, which is what Liam is doing, or engaging directly communities, which is what Chiedza and Andre are doing, is a solution. But yeah, in my field, which is, as I said, socially engaged art, it's laughable, the idea that we are going to change the world just by putting, you know, documentation of a performance on the walls of a gallery. But so, yeah, there's the necessity of going towards the public and as you said, like knocking on doors and finding the people to involve. But maybe you wanted to.
Well, just to say that, you know, the internet, it's the perfect space, because as you said, not many people visit galleries. Most people don't visit galleries. Artist-run centers are not even in there. My museums might be, but not galleries or artist-run centers. So, you know, the internet, it's and all of these platforms that people is looking, whether they're on the metro walking. This is where information, this is where other kinds of world can be disseminated. And the problem is how to put them out there in a way that reach out not only artist communities, like looking at Instagram or Facebook or all of that, but other people that might find an interesting video about a virtual reality project where there is not only good-looking people or embellished spaces, you know, like how can we disseminate work like Octavia Butler's in ways that these imaginary worlds with not binaries, subjectivities are depicted and are honored. How can that become part of popular culture? And I think it's through the internet, but how can we reach out other audiences that are not already familiar with who's Octavia Butler, who's producing this kind of interesting work in architecture or artists?
I shouldn't intervene like that all the time, but internet has its own problem where we see this trend, or apparently we all live in our own bubble and we see what we want to see and what we are comfortable with seeing.
Yeah, because we don't see what we want to see sometimes. Like, you know, like even like when your search engine, all of the things that you see on Facebook, it's based on what you're already looking. So it's with the same. If you and I Google the same word, we're not going to have the same results. And so how our previous search or something or orientations already shape what we are going to see. So yeah, I mean, it's not to say that the internet is the best thing ever. It's just to say, like, people use more internet than they go to galleries. So how can you use those technologies and digital platforms to disseminate these other possible futures?
So I'd like to offer something too in response to your question. I think there's also this necessity to step away from our familiar environments. I recently was doing research with paper, analog research, in libraries, touching books, and like you've just mentioned, like when you're on a computer, you see the screen and you only see the screen, whereas when you have a book, you have the opportunity to discover, to find other pages and other content that you weren't seeking, that inform what you might be researching. And I'm finding that more and more the necessity to branch out is there. So if I'm seeing myself only as a curator, I'm missing out on everything else. I'm missing out on the other sectors that exist, and those are the ones that will inform my work as a curator. So I think even as we're, you know, designing and inventing a new future, it's about beginning to create small pods of cross-disciplinary like communities and groups, so that when you're working, you're not working just in a silo with just a bunch of other designers, or, you know, that you have people who know nothing about the ins and outs of your work, because it has to be rooted in reality, in you know, be what it is to be human for us to really move forward, I think. And so that's something that I think is really, really critical, is working with people from different sectors, starting with like what is human as much as possible, and then taking it from there.
Yeah, a lot of people don't go to galleries and exhibitions, and a lot of our exhibition was looking at like the severe lack of representation of Black artists and designers, both in like the exhibiting role or in the role of being in the gallery, and then also in attendance. And I think that the sort of like process of exhibiting is just like a small piece, and some of the work that we do, and with the Dean of Design at OCAD, who is a key in organizing this exhibition, Dori Tunstall. Her initiative looks at directly like engaging with communities in Toronto, and making sure that not only these ideas about technology get, you know, shown and talked about in these spaces, but also how do we take technology, art, design to those places where that representation is lacking, and that looks like you know, workshops and different activities that are not constrained in one place, that go directly to the source. And I think that's important in kind of solving that problem.
Okay. I think this is going to be our conclusion. Thank you for staying with us and for listening.
Thank you.